Okay, welcome everyone. I think we should get started. It's 10:30. Maybe we'll give another chance for people to come in. While we're waiting, I just want to know what are the representation in the room. So I know we have a few folks from CGR centers that I'm friends with. I know some of you. I know we have someone from a University of Nebraska, some students, international organization or local NGO. Can you tell us where you're from?
Hello everyone, my name is Sharon Cherono. I'm from the African Center for Environment, Energy and Climate Advocacy.
Okay. And is that an NGO?
Yeah, it's an NGO here in Kenya.
In Kenya?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And how about you, sir?
Hello, I'm Griffin Oke from Port Health Services.
From where?
Port Health Services.
Port Health Services.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So we have folks from different, areas, whether it is CG centers, from NGOs, from universities, and also students here today. And we're going to talk about the pathway to sustainability of CGIAR's most critical assets. But what I'm going to talk about today applies to anyone who has assets in their work, whether it's at a university, at a NGO, and also a business, for example. So all of these things will be applicable to wherever you are working. So I think then let me introduce myself. I'm Gail Amara. I am the CGIAR Senior Director for Facility Management, Security, and Administration. I had to look to remember. And I formerly was the head of administration at ILRI in Ethiopia. So I'm based in Ethiopia. I live in Addis Ababa, but originally from Kansas in the United States. So thank you very much. I think we'll get started. I have a colleague on the line named Louise. Say hi, Louise.
Hello, everybody.
There's Louise. And so if there are people on the line, and if they have questions or anything, she may interrupt at some point during the presentation. So I think to start off, I wanted to share with you a video, and this is a video that I had made about a year ago. I'm not going to show the whole video because some of it doesn't apply to what we're discussing today, but it will give you kind of a sense of some of the facilities and assets that we have across the CGIAR in the different countries around the world. It will get louder.
Here in Ethiopia, we saw that improving chicken productivity could play a big role in alleviating poverty, from helping to generate income to offering food and nutrition security, especially for women. While we were able to accomplish a lot through our partners, we recognized that it was important to have our own poultry research facility where we could control certain environmental factors over a long period of time in partnership with CTLGH and others. With a small investment of $300,000 US, we were able to build this poultry facility. The investment allowed us to attract millions of dollars in other funding that was critical for our work. Today, we have been able to record up to 200% increase in egg production and a 300% increase in body weight from tropically adapted and more productive chicken breeds compared to African indigenous breeds. Now, we in TPG's Tropical Poultry Genetic Solutions are entering a new phase where this work is being scaled up from Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Nigeria to Kenya, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam.
World Fish produces faster growing fish to improve food and nutrition security and livelihoods in agri-food systems. That needs state-of-the-art, biosecure and safe facilities to rear fish and maintain this globally important germplasm for the future. Further investment in dedicated fish genetic improvement facilities in Africa and Asia will ensure aquatic foods continue to be produced more efficiently in a changing climate.
In SIP, we have an urgent responsibility to advance scientific research and innovation in potato and sweet potato because we need to respond to the changing climate and have potato and sweet potato varieties that can withstand increased abiotic and biotic disease pressure. To fulfill this mission, it's crucial that our facilities are purpose-built. For example, we need basic infrastructure like this greenhouse to grow the new potato seedlings that we produce every year from crosses. The tiny seed produced after crossing are too fragile to sow directly in the field. Instead, we need a greenhouse where these plants will produce the first generation of tuber seed for further testing in the field. In this greenhouse, we have 11,000 plants that need to be watered and cared for. To decrease manual labor, we need an automatic irrigation system, which we have in this particular greenhouse. To accommodate all new plants produced each year, we need several greenhouses like this one. To identify the necessary funds for upgrading and constant maintenance is challenging in the current system, and an urgent change is needed to maintain the high standards expected of a leading global research organization.
Okay, great. So that's just kind of gives you an overview of what some of our facilities look like around the globe. And you heard in Ethiopia, there was the example of the poultry farm where a very small investment was able to unlock a potential of the research there. And it ended up attracting millions of dollars in other research. So sometimes a small investment in a humble facility can help really transform. And with that, they increase egg productivity by 200% and the body weight of chickens by 300%. So it's very important that we have access to these very important facilities. So I'm going to give you an overview of a study that we did on assets across the CGIAR system. And then I'm going to talk about some of the learnings from that and also what we'll be doing in the next year, but some of the learnings of that could apply in all the different scenarios that we talked about at the very beginning of the study, this presentation today. So as you see here, the CGIAR has been around for 50 to 60 years in some countries. And over time, there have been many breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs, which have affected the accessibility of food throughout the world. Nutritious food and also biosecure and climate resilient food as well. So here are some few examples of wheat, biofortified crops, high yield and resistant aquaculture. You see rice here, flood tolerant rice and resilient beans. And I put also the names of some of the researchers that have achieved some great breakthroughs in science in the CGIAR. But all of this wouldn't be possible without assets. We have to have those assets, and they have to be in good working order, in good condition, in order for them to be able to produce. So assets underpin our research. So as you've been here this week, you've been hearing about CGIAR's strategy, the portfolio, the science programs that we'll be implementing over the next 5 years. And if we don't have assets that are ready to support that and in good functioning order, that strategy will not succeed. So that's very important that we understand what our assets do we have and in what order are they. So I'm going to set the scene a little bit of the environment that we're in, especially considering the funding, and I know that's on the minds of a lot of us. Over time, the demand for assets continually increases. There are always needs for different kinds of equipment, different types of technology. So we began with a modest set of investments, and it's grown over the years. And it's at the same time, there's some changing dynamics on the planet and in our own world that make it difficult to keep those assets maintained. There are rising costs, of course. There's adapting to new technologies and new standards that are coming out. There are tighter regulations, and there's also aging infrastructure. In the CGIAR, many of our buildings are over 40 years old, and so they need to be updated. The sewage system underneath them, the irrigation system, et cetera, it needs help. And I'm going to just reduce our picture of you, Louise, so that we can see the screen. At the same time, in the CGIAR, in the early days of the CGIAR, we had access to unrestricted funds, and that allowed us to maintain those assets. It helped us to build the buildings and create the labs and acquire equipment and manage the research fields. And that funding was 85% unrestricted funding in the beginning of the CGIAR. And now that has dwindled to only 15%. So we have very little funds to play with that we can use to manage those assets. At the same time, there's pressure from our funders to keep our overhead rates low. So many people have the misconception that assets are managed using overhead. But if we did, our overhead rates would be like at a university level, like 45%, something like that. But no, we can't do that. Our overhead rates have to be kept low. So that's another constraint. On top of that, now we have funding uncertainty, which I think many of us are feeling, right, throughout the system. And that's making things a little even more concerning. So this has put our institutions in the CG in a financial bind. That's why I wrapped it in a rope here to show that they're being squeezed. Like if you look at all of this, it feels a little hopeless. How on earth can you manage the assets in this situation? So that means we have a near complete dependence on what we call full cost recovery. In order for us to survive, we need to find a way to recover the cost of every asset we buy. So if we buy a vehicle, we have to figure out how to charge that vehicle to the project or to whoever's using it so that we can pay for the cost of that vehicle. And same with every other asset we have. But the reality is that 100% full cost recovery is quite challenging to achieve. When we polled our centers in the last year and we asked them asset by asset, they gave us a list of 3,000 assets. And for every single asset, we said, are you able to fully recover the cost of this asset? And they said yes, about a third of the time, actually less than a third of the time, very, very little. So that means we have challenges with full cost recovery. So how on earth can we keep the system running and maintain these assets and have them in a readiness condition in order to support the strategy? It's a big challenge. So why is it challenging to achieve 100% full cost recovery? Part of it is that sometimes we have a donor and they say, yes, we will pay that full cost recovery, no problem. But then when they get the bill, they may challenge line items and say, yeah, but I agree with full cost recovery, but what is this? So if the costs are not transparent and they're not clearly explained and there's not a clear agreement, it can be challenging, and it can vary from funder to funder and even from agreement to agreement with the same funder. So there can also be challenges with the methodology, like how did you calculate the methodology? How did you share the methodology? And then also there is unused or partially used capacity. Sometimes we just don't have a full capacity. So we're planning on charging something at a rate at a certain level of usage, but then we don't achieve that level of usage. So these are all kind of setting the scene for some of the challenges that we face. So this is why the asset study was requested. It was requested by our system council at the CGIAR, and then commissioned by our executive managing director, Ismahan Olafi. And I'm leading that study. We have a steering group of people that are from every center, from each of the CGIAR centers. And the main question we're trying to answer is, how do we ensure the long-term sustainability of our most critical assets? How do you do that? Given the scenarios, the funding environment that I just shared with you. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the asset study. In broad terms, I'm going to share with you what is it that we're doing and what have we done so far and what are we going to be doing in the next year. And then I'm going to talk about observations that we've made as we've been going through the study, where there are opportunities for us to do more with less. So we're going to be having less. How are we going to do more? Because we have to do more at the same time. And then we'll address solutions. And in that, I'm going to talk about not every element, but some 4 key elements in asset sustainability framework. So we're going to start with achievements of this asset study. I don't know if I can minimize this here so you can see, but okay. Data, there it goes. Okay. So the first thing we did is we collected data on over 3,000 assets. And as I will explain later, it's not as easy as just getting the asset register from every center because we want to know how are these assets managed? How are the assets, what is the capability of the assets? And what are the challenges faced in managing and getting the funding for those assets? And then we also wanted to know about some assets that were not on the register, such as intangible assets. Intangible meaning data sets, data models, knowledge repositories, things that don't have a, an ID tag on them. So it's not just things in the asset register. So after that, we created an asset dashboard. We call it the global asset repository. I'm going to show you what that looks like so you can see what we did with that. And then we identified some of the key enablers that we think are important for this roadmap to sustainability. And we've designed kind of the pathway. So I'm going to be sharing some of that with you today. And then one of the key things we did, because now we are launching the new science programs, as you've heard this week, is asset alignment. How do we determine which science program is going to be meeting which of these assets? And then are they ready to support those programs, and what are the funding needs of those assets? And then finally, we developed some investment cases. So we identified assets that need improvement, and then we've created and prioritized investment cases for major funding gaps, for new assets, and also upgrades. This is the asset portfolio, the dashboard we created with all of the data that we collected from 15 different CGIAR centers. And you can see we have 3,000 assets in here. We've got intangible and tangible assets. And we can segment this data by lots of different ways. So I'll just show you a couple examples. So for example, if I want to know about data models that we have across the CG, let's say I'm a researcher and I want to know, I'm doing a data model, and I want to know who else has done data models already. I can pull them up and I can see what are the thematic focuses of those models. For example, crop improvement. I can see what is the geographic focus of those models. I can see if they have been copyrighted, or if there's been any kind of IP protection, or if they are in process, and also some basic descriptions of who is doing it and how I could reach them. We also have plotted out all of the facilities that we have globally on a map. So I know we have over, I think, 300 facilities globally that we use. But if I wanted to just look at research stations and fields, I can see, okay, they're located in 44 countries. And 40% of the time, these facilities that we use, the research stations and fields that we use for breeding work, etc., 40% of them actually belong to our national agricultural research systems, which means a strong partnership with national agricultural research systems. And then we can also take a look close in at a certain city, and we can say, okay, where, in this city, why do we have 6 facilities here? Do we need 6? Maybe there's an opportunity for us to work together. Maybe there's a great reason why there are 6. But it gives us an opportunity to zero in and say, here's an opportunity for a conversation. Maybe we could consolidate facilities and save resources here. And we also are able to take a look at all the labs that we have across the CG. So for example, so far we've collected 191 labs, and I would say it's not complete. There are going to be probably more labs that we haven't added in here yet, but we can categorize them by lab type, by the technologies and different platforms. We can see them on the map. And then, for example, if I wanted to look at genetic resources and breeding labs, I can also identify what is the condition of the labs, what is the utilization, lab safety, and accreditation of those labs. So as we've been doing this, once we've collected the data, we're able to take a look at it and understand a little bit about the assets we have globally. One of the things that we've recognized is there are certain assets that require special consideration for long-term uninterrupted funding. We know we have gene banks in the CGIAR where we collect the germplasm of different types of seeds around the world. But we also collect other kinds of germplasm, such as disease vectors. We have aquatic and invertebrate germplasm. Tree seed is not included in the crop trust gene banks. Banana, cassava, and then sometimes there's cassava that has been collected under a project, and it's not necessarily funded. So we've collected that, but now how do we make sure we maintain that forever into the future? We also have long-term experiments. There's an example of one in Erie in the Philippines that has been around for 60 years. But it means in order to do that, you need to be able to maintain that long-term trial every single year, and it can't fail. If you have gaps in taking care of that long-term trial, you may have gaps in your data, and it could affect the effectiveness of using that data. But project funding doesn't like to fund long-term trials. So how do we maintain that? And also the vast data that we have around the CG, we collect wonderful data, and it has the potential, once we start tapping into AI, to revolutionize agricultural research and innovation in the world. But if that data isn't updated, if it isn't managed, then how can we use that data? And so anyway, that kind of gives you a sense of some of the challenges that we've been facing. So one of the things we did this year is, and again, I don't know how to get this thing to move out of the way. But so one of the things we've done is what we call a funnel analysis on our assets. So first we took all assets that we have, and this is something that people could do in their own institutions. And then we tried to understand which of them are aligned with the strategy. So which assets are important for the work that we're doing? Not all assets are probably strategic. So going through an exercise, and I'll kind of give you some ideas about what this looked like to identify which ones are aligned. And in this case, we were looking for assets aligned to the science programs that we've been talking about this week. In the centers, they also have multilateral projects. They have other objectives that are not related necessarily to the CGIAR's programs. But for this purpose, that's what we were looking at. And then we asked ourselves, could that asset be outsourced? Is it necessary that we do it in-house? We asked, is there some certain level of efficiency in that asset, or could we improve on that efficiency? And have we tried our best to maximize cost recovery? And at the end of the day, if we said yes to all of this, we may have at the end of the day a funding gap. We're still not able to fully recover the cost of that. And so in those cases, we may need to seek alternative funding for how we can fund that gap, especially if we've identified it's a strategic asset. So in the asset study, just to kind of give you a view of where we're headed, we've already done some things like we've understood our asset portfolio. We created the global asset repository. We've identified which assets are strategic to the strategy. the CGIAR strategy, and we've developed some priority investment cases. But now is kind of some of the hard work that needs to be done, which is how do we access sustainable funding for our assets from funders? And we know now the funding environment is very tight, so this may be very hard to do. So hand in hand with that, we need to also address the full cost recovery models. If they're not working, how could we improve them? How could we tighten them so they work? And then we need to be looking at optimization and efficiency. How could we squeeze better efficiency of our assets so that we are not leaking funds, that we can use those funds to help cover any gap? And then finally, for environmental stewardship, this is also here because it's very key for us, and many of our centers have made great progress in this. So I'll just give a shout out to a few of the centers for some of the work they've done. So for example, CIAT has a very good full cost recovery process. I think ILRI does as well. And they're able to fully recover some of the costs of their assets. In optimization and efficiency, ICARDA has done a really good job of utilizing the assets of the NARS system, the National Agricultural Research Institutes, so that they don't have to build their own labs and things like that. They can utilize the labs of their partner, and they can help strengthen the National Agricultural Research System. So this has been a great model to look at. And under environmental stewardships, we have several centers who are already kind of pioneering this. I would say the best out of all of them is UMI. They have already have several years of carbon accounting data that they're working on. But we also have ILRI, World Fish, IRRI, and CIAT also in the Global Compact. Okay, so I'm going to now, oh yeah, sorry, I just want to share with you our priorities for 2025. So the first thing we're going to be doing this year is working on improving our dashboard, improving the data in it, and then looking at funding modalities by asset type. So if it's a germplasm versus a long-term trial versus a data model, what are different funding modalities that may work? There may be different funding modalities. And then asset cost recovery methodologies. How could we, let's understand why it doesn't work in some places or why it is not 100% working, and see how we could improve that. And then finally, lessons learned in optimization and efficiency. How can we improve? How can we learn from previous experiences? We know we have some great examples already across the CG where centers have achieved great efficiency. They have optimized. And then how can we, looking at the data that we have, identify other opportunities for optimizing our assets? So now I'm going to share some interesting scenarios that occur when you have assets, and how could they perhaps unlock some opportunities to achieve some efficiency. So some of you may recognize these scenarios, and if you do, you can also shout out about it or add some more. So these scenarios are, we are in this tight environment where we're really being squeezed with our funding. And the scenarios I'm going to share with you, I want to say they're not specific examples that I'm going to say this center did this or that center did that, but these are common scenarios that we see all the time, whether it's in business, in universities, and other organizations, but also I'm sure they exist throughout the CG as well. So given the resource constraints we have, how can we use these scenarios to understand them and improve so that we can do more with less? So the first one is investment in redundant assets. So for example, I've made some nice images here. So we've got 2 lab managers in 2 labs right next to each other. And they're like, oops, we both bought the exact same equipment. And this does happen. Sometimes it's not right next to each other, but maybe in the same city even, or in a neighboring facility where you have procurement of the same asset. And we could consolidate and perhaps not do that. Another one is, and I showed you that picture in Bangladesh where we had 6 facilities. So here's 4 facilities within walking distance. So is it necessary for us all to have different buildings? This happens in a natural way. It's not intentional, but it does occur. And so here again is an opportunity. And then sometimes I've heard stories of, let's say we have a greenhouse and that greenhouse is in need of an upgrade, but the money available is not for an upgrade. It's only for a new asset. So instead of upgrading the greenhouse that we have, we build a new greenhouse right next to it. And now what we have to do is, we were struggling already to maintain one greenhouse. Now we have to maintain two because the money was only for a new greenhouse. And here are data platforms, and they're each on a separate island. And here's another data platform coming up that's being built. And these are not connected because sometimes when we have, let's say, funds to build a data platform for our work, we may find it's much easier to just build it separately, because doing the interconnectivity between it can be more challenging. You have to work with others. It takes more time to figure out. So people are in a hurry and they just build a separate island of their data. Anyone resonate with some of these scenarios? Okay. The second one is one of my favorites, and it's unintended incentives. That sometimes the way the incentives are built into the way we work, it doesn't promote sharing or collaborating with our assets. So some examples. Again, this guy on the street, and then there's a lady here saying, oh, the donor just approved our office budget, so we're going to go ahead and rent out a fifth office on the street because she's got money in her budget. So why wouldn't she do it? So the incentive is not there for her to share assets. Here's another one where we have technicians ready to go and build bridges between these data platforms, but there's no incentive to make it happen because it takes extra money, extra effort, coordination across these different folks. And folks are in a hurry to deliver on the project that they have at hand. Tommy's favorite. We've got vehicles that maybe we hold on to for long periods of time because there's a risk that if I give up my vehicle, I might not get it replaced. So I would rather just hold on to this piece of lab equipment that I have because it took me a long time to get the money for it. And so if I sell it, it's old now, it's not really working well, but I got to keep it because it's better than having no lab equipment. Same with the vehicle. And then sometimes we've got great data. Maybe that was a project that happened 5 years ago, and now we really would like to leverage that data to learn from it for something else. But now the person who did that is gone, it's locked up in a file cabinet or on their hard drive somewhere, and we don't have access to that data. So we've got to reproduce the data again. And finally, the same people here buying two equipment, maybe it's not that they didn't know that the other person had the equipment, but they did know, but they had money in their budget. So they went ahead and they said, yeah, I know that they already have it, but I've got money in my budget and I prefer a different brand. I really don't want that brand. And sharing is not convenient because when I want to use that equipment, it's not available. So these are some of the realities that happen. Another one is competing with outsourcing. Sometimes we invest heavily in a lab, or I'm picking on labs. It could be anything. It could be hospitality services. It could be residential houses. There are many other examples, office space, transport services, vehicles. So we invest and we have that asset available. Here it's costing $3 signs. But then the project comes, the program or the project, and they need to deliver the work that they're doing faster, better, and cheaper. And they find that working in this lab may take more time, and it might be more costly because they don't deliver as many samples. And maybe their equipment is old because they haven't updated it. And so they find it much faster, better, cheaper if they go outsource somewhere else. And this can be right in the same institution. So when this happens, though, we end up paying twice because we paid for this lab to be built and to be maintained, and we've got to maintain it, but we're also paying for that outsourced services being done. And then this is the story of deferred maintenance, where we have, you can see a technician here, and on the wall it said, routine maintenance has been deferred in January, again in February, again in March, again in April. So why does this happen? Maybe they didn't plan for the life cycle costs of this asset. So a project got some funds, and they were like, I'm going to build a new lab because I need it. They have the funds for the acquisition of the asset, but not for the maintenance and upkeep of that asset over time. So now there's no planning for how we're going to maintain that asset into the future. And the costs are not, or maybe the costs aren't fully utilized because there's no demand for that asset. Nobody's actually using it. So these are all the different kinds of scenarios that I've kind of shared with you. So what I'm asking is, how could we turn some of these scenarios into opportunities for cost savings? If anyone wants to jump in, you may. But I will talk about that. So I don't know, have anyone seen these kind of scenarios in their work? Yes. Yeah, okay. And I want to say something really interesting, and that's that a lot of these scenarios occur naturally. It is not, it just happens. And if you don't have a policy framework or some kind of guidelines that prevent it from happening, it will happen. So a lot of times in institutions, we operate and we do our work, but we don't have these kind of policies set up. And so those frameworks need to be set up at some point. So now I'm going to talk about the pathway to sustainability of our most critical assets. So how do we address those scenarios that I just talked about? So as I mentioned before, our resources are being squeezed. But in the absence of having a framework, when I say a framework, I mean policies, procedures, and guidelines that tell us how to use and manage our assets. If we don't have them, then each of these boxes, these scenarios that I've showed you here, represent money going down the drain. And at the same time, we're in a tight situation where we really need to retain our assets. So it's important that we do have an asset management framework, basically. And if we don't address these challenges, then the institution will begin to face asset failure. You'll have expensive emergency repairs. The research could be disrupted. And that could put the institution at risk from being able to deliver on its mission. And the science programs that we've been talking about this week, you've been to these programs, and have you heard anyone talking about assets at all? I haven't heard it mentioned once, but this is critical. If we don't have this together, then they won't be able to do their research. So 4 elements, I'm going to mention only 4. There are like 10 of them, but I'm going to tell you just 4, and then we're going to wrap up. So for the elements of an asset sustainability framework, I'm going to go through them one by one. So the first is to know and share information about tangible and intangible assets. So what does that mean? I showed you our asset repository where we gathered information on 3,000 assets across the CG. I would say there's more to go. We don't have all the data that we need, but we've got a good start. And as I said in the beginning, it's more than just an asset register. We have tangible assets that we can see and put a tag on, but we have intangible assets also, such as our data sets and our knowledge, our beautiful data models that we've built. And then if that project ends and that data model can't be maintained, we've lost that great asset that we have. So a lot of even accounting standards don't always have a way of accounting for your intangible assets, so they don't show up in the asset register. So this would be very important to be able to understand what your intangible assets are. What are the research capabilities of your assets? What is the condition of the asset? And what's required to get it in a readiness condition that it can support the research? What is the utilization of the asset? And when we say utilization, this is also the hard part, because every asset you have has a different measure of utilization. For some of them, it might be occupancy in a room. For others, it might be the number of times that you've used the machine. So it's important to understand what is the unit of measure, what's the target and the current performance. And then what's the ownership or any kind of legal parameters for that asset or any standards that are governing the asset. Again, these are things you don't find on an asset register. So this will help prevent duplication of investments, and it also increased utilization of existing assets. So that asset repository I showed you now our CGIAR centers can look and see who already bought this machine. They can look across in the data and they can see who already bought that machine. Maybe I also don't need to buy it. I can just utilize theirs. And as we improve the data, hopefully we'll also be able to identify important assets in the NARS system as well, the National Agricultural Research Partner. So we can also utilize their assets. The second is creating a framework for deciding on which assets are strategic. This is probably the hardest step. How do you figure out which asset is more important than another asset? How do you do that? So I think each institution needs to create their own framework. It is not easy to, top down say everybody has the same framework. Across the CG even, there's a difference in ILRI that does livestock and UMI that does water, and then IFPRI, which does data models. So very different kinds of priorities for assets there. So what assets are required to deliver on the institution's strategy? Once you've identified your strategy, now you can say, okay, here's the strategy we're delivering. Now, what assets do we need to deliver that? Rather than going through the list of assets saying, is this one important? Yes. Is this one important? Yes. Everything will be yes, I promise. It's better to say, what is the strategy I'm trying to deliver and what assets do I need to deliver it? And the ones that you didn't choose are probably not as strategic. What's the comparative advantage that that asset brings to your institution? Do you have access to an asset that is unique? I think at ILRI you have some pretty unique assets that you don't find in other places. That brings a comparative advantage. That would be a hint that's a strategic asset that you need to really take care of and prioritize. What is the strategic intent of each asset? And what are the support assets you need? So you might have a very unique asset, but you also need to have electricity, water, irrigation, other things that are important for supporting that asset. And then list those assets in order of priority, which ones are most important. And you can use something like a decision tree here to help with that. So this helps us to conserve our resources and distribute them wisely. If we've got limited resources, we are constrained, then we need to figure out which ones we should prioritize. So this is very important for determining that. The next is reinforcing governance and incentives, incentive structures. And this is also really key. And probably if we don't have this, then a lot of money goes down the drain. So govern procurement of assets. So when we procure assets, if there's a way for kind of a viewpoint of, do we already have that asset or does it exist somewhere else? This would help in that. Making deliberate decisions before we decide to move into another country or move into another facility and another location. Because when you do that, it also means new assets that have to be procured and built. Development or even adding in new services, that those services maybe could have been outsourced. So be decisive about which assets need to be outsourced, decommissioned, consolidated, invested in, or maintained. So once you know which assets are strategic, you can then decide which assets do I have to invest in and maintain them at all costs, and which ones perhaps I need to outsource, which ones can I move on. And then create the policies, the guidelines, and the procedures to make those things happen. And then work with our funders for healthier incentives. Sometimes it's the funder providing the funds. It was like giving you plenty of money so that you could just buy everything. And if they could help incentivize for sharing, that would also help. So this step helps us to incentivize more efficient behavior. And then finally, strengthening life cycle costing. So we need to know the true life cycle costs of our assets before we procure them. If you look along the bottom, there's acquisition costs of an asset. There is a commissioning, meaning getting it running, installing it and getting it running. There's the operating costs, there's the maintenance costs. And then at the end of the day, we have to decommission it. We have to get rid of the asset. And then we have to dispose of the asset. And you can see some percentages here that kind of show you about what percent of total costs those areas are. But mostly we think about acquisition costs. We're usually focused on acquisition costs. The project is thinking about how much will it cost to buy that asset. And they have no thought about the rest of the life cycle costs. And this is why we get into these issues of deferred maintenance, where we can't afford to maintain the assets later. So I'm getting to the end here. So in our asset study, one of the things we're working on is making sure that we provide a system-wide view of information for our CGIAR centers so that they can have information for decision-making at the center level. It's not to try to impose from a CGIAR perspective what assets what center should have, but to provide them with the information so that could help them to optimize their own assets. So in doing that, we're helping the centers to do more with less, to visualize opportunities for them to be more efficient with their assets, to maximize the asset cost recovery, to improve the asset utilization. With the dashboard that I show you, they can see other assets that are there, strengthen their asset sustainability framework, which I was showing you the pictures of, and identify asset funding streams. And that's really the last piece. After you've done everything else and you're more efficient, then we can also go to donors and ask, we've got this asset, we've done everything we can, we've made it as efficient as possible, we have a framework in place, so we're not wasting any money. But this is a very important asset, and full cost recovery is not working. So donor, please help us with this asset. That's the time to go to the donor after we've done all of these other steps. So I think that is it. And the idea here really is we need fit for future assets. We need assets that are ready to support the strategy that is coming to us, and they need to be in readiness condition. So it's important to optimize our asset base, make sure we have the right assets and that they're in great shape. And if we need to, then we might need to dispose of some assets that are not supporting the strategy. So thank you. Any questions or discussion? I don't know if Louise, if there's anyone online also who has questions in the chat.
We do have people online, but no questions have come up yet. I'm just reminding them.
Okay, great. Great. Any discussion, questions? Yes.
Hi, Neil. First of all, very good presentation. Let me introduce myself. My name is Andres Pala. I'm the head of operations of ILRI. All that you've said there, it's very close to all of us who have to do with anything related to facilities or really anything to do with operations. Particularly because we are the people at the front line when research needs something that we sort of have, but it's not in good shape. So more than a question, it's a comment that in the end, what makes the difference is to have the discipline to implement what is needed to be done. Because the policies and procedures are mostly there. We just need to use common sense and have the discipline to implement. I don't know if have you had any comments on that regard? Over.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the biggest challenges here is you can go through this whole exercise, identify what's strategic, identify what probably needs to be outsourced or decommissioned, but then carrying that out to decision is very hard. And as we let that asset sit there, the dollar signs keep going down the drain. I hope, though, that in this current environment where we have very little resources, this will be a call to action, hopefully, to really take a look at that. It's a challenging one. When I had the hat on of head of administration, I don't want to let go of any of my assets. It's very hard when you're at a center and you're saying, we've got this lab, we have this, we have that. I don't want to let go of those things. I want to keep them. Nobody wants to let go of them. That's why you need the framework, you need the policy, and you need some big level decisions to make, because it's very hard to do. There's a lot of emotion attached to the assets. Yeah.
Diana Calegari, I'm from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So we see that very often, considering that the US has the land-grant universities, and then we also have the USDA ARSs basically in every state. There's a lot of repetition of assets that could be used in common when you have a 30-mile distance between centers. But one of the things that I have been noticing a lot, we used to host a lot of fellows from the Feed the Future countries the last few years, funded by global programs through USDA Foreign Services. And a lot of them would look at us and see these assets that have been replaced by newer models. Could we take these to our facilities? So perhaps could have and I know of a lot of new young institutions and universities in Ghana and across Africa and other developing countries that could definitely benefit to start developing their own labs. Do you see a possibility of creating a policy that would allow us to transfer these assets for these institutions that have less assets that could start developing their own research, at least for teaching?
I think that might be a great way to motivate refreshing the assets, because if you know that it's going somewhere useful, it helps. One of the scenarios that I didn't draw was a picture of. I didn't draw these, by the way. AI did, but one picture I wanted to try to generate was, and I thought I have too many cartoons in my slides, is an asset sitting there saying we might need this, a sign that says don't throw it away because we might need this. And we have so many of those kinds of assets laying around, and no one wants to take accountability for saying, okay, dispose of this asset. But when you know you can send it to a place that actually needs it, that's a high motivation to try to clean out those assets. I think in CG centers, we usually work with our national agricultural partners, and we would probably donate them as much as possible to those partners. Yeah. Yeah, if there's, there may not, maybe there will be now. Yes. Okay. Other comments or anything resonate with you that you want to share? Okay.
Gail,
Well,
can
yes.
I mention?
Sure.
Yeah, so maybe just to start a conversation, you said in the study you're listing out all your assets. So is this everything from weighing scales, spectrophotometers, chairs, tablets, laptops, everything? So if I needed to take this now as a blueprint and do it at my own institution, is that your recommendation?
Yeah, that's a great point. So when we did ours, we made some thresholds because we really don't want to have to worry about chairs and things like that, although they're important for asset management, like to take care of them. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're really talking about strategic assets. What are your big assets? But also, what are the assets that are not strategic, that are sitting around and draining resources? So it's important to have a full list, and maybe it's better to just have a threshold. What are the assets that maybe over a certain threshold. I think in our case, we did $50,000 for most assets.
How can we approach the conversation with funders when, some of their stipulations are they don't want to upgrade a net house or a screen house or an asset. They want to build new. How can we tackle that?
I don't know if anyone else has suggestions, but I would just say that some donors are really limited by their own regulations. They may not have a choice. But it would be good to illustrate the impact of some of those regulations so that they could help perhaps change them if needed. But stories are very helpful. So if you can do case studies or stories, that would be great. And speaking of case studies, I wanted to mention that in our asset study, we are looking for case studies that we could illustrate, stories like this, that we can say, this is a reality that happens sometimes, and these are things that could be done about it. So if anyone can think of an interesting case study for us to study, we would be interested to know either successes or failures in some of the things that we talked about. George, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the beautiful presentation. I mean, my name is George Ulo. I'm head of corporate services in Ethiopia. Of course, I replaced Gail. So it's interesting for me is that we have the donors regulations on one side. Then we also have our in-country issues that are also at play. Internally, we have assets that we need to replace. The donors tells you we don't have money for replacement. They want you to do a new one. So then the interesting discussion that comes, what about outsourcing? It would be interesting to know, I mean, to what level can you outsource? I mean, because when you outsource, I mean, probably we don't have control of turnaround time of some of the resource that we require. But it will be very interesting to look at to what extent can we outsource, and is there a way that the CG centers can have a pool of where we can have like a hub, where we have a model lab or a group of assets that can be unique to that to a particular region, so that that can help. Would that really help to solve some of the problems? I know it can't solve everything, but what's the way forward? Because sometimes we keep on grappling with we set a sample to, like, sometimes send samples to France, then turnaround time is there. We have the National Agricultural Research Institutes there. They need our support. So I'm really interested to know to what extent can we consider outsourcing?
That's really a great question, and I was thinking about elaborating on this, but I want to share one thing that's very interesting. There is a group here, one of the projects, the science programs is Breeding for Tomorrow. And in Breeding for Tomorrow, they have breeders who want faster, better, cheaper lab results. They need it, the turnaround time to be very fast. So what they've done is developed a unit, and they're having a meeting right now, so otherwise I would be there today. They have developed a unit that is breeding resources. And what they've done is they've identified places where their breeders can get fast lab results. And they've negotiated rates so that they're very cheap. So the CGIAR centers really cannot compete with the rates that they have developed in this program. So they have already begun drawing, creating this scenario where the researchers are very happy because they're getting faster, better, cheaper results, but the labs are crying because now no one's coming to their lab. So now what's the solution? I asked him, could a CGIAR center compete? Could we get together and become that lab? Or would it even be possible to do? The thing is, it may be very challenging to do, because in order for us to do it, some of these outsourced labs, they may produce 1,000 samples a day, and we are not going to be doing that. They also can buy new equipment, every time it's needed, and we take years to replace our equipment. But it's something to consider. And now I believe that this kind of pressure will increase, because the researchers are demanding faster, better, cheaper. So can we compete? So we may have to begin outsourcing labs. We may have to think about which of the lab services that we do, what type of services we do, have to be retained in-house, and which ones need to be outsourced. And we may need to give up some of the ones that we think we need. Might be possible. Or we could become the service provider for the CG. That's another possibility. So a center could say, hey, I can do this service faster, better, cheaper, or near that, and I will become the service provider for all of the CG. So there's an opportunity there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, could you use your mic? Yeah.
I have heard a lot from the industry and small businesses saying that a lot of students get out of with a degree without the training, hands-on training and knowledge on testing of lab or aflatoxin. So that might be a good partnership with universities, local universities, to offer your labs.
Yeah, that's a great point. Capacity building. I know we've done that at ILRI as well, offering capacity building services as a way of maintaining your lab and also building capacity. Will be offered to universities. Okay, great question. I think it's coming, definitely. The pressure will come. Okay, any other questions? Yes, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nancy, and to add on that about students, when it comes to, for example, I remember during my internship, I went to a lab and there were so many students, but when it came to equipment and everything, but as a student, you really want to go. But from this side, they are saying you don't have equipment, but you're like, I want to come for me to graduate. So that would be a very great initiative to support students, and to equip them with the skills and knowledge. I think.
Yeah, I know ILRI in Nairobi has a capacity building lab, and I don't know the condition of it, if it's still, in that state right now, but because it needs funding also to do that. So if the funding is not there, it becomes challenging. Okay, yes.
Thank you, Gail. My name is Haftamu, and I'm head of supply chain for ILRI. My comment is, I think, to ensure better utilization of this CGIAR center. I mean, one of the things is, I think, lack of knowing which institutes having, what kind of facility. So how we can get, access to this dashboard report so that all researchers, based in one center can know CIAT or ICAT has having this kind of facility, so that before we go to, sourcing from outside, we can leverage the internal resources.
Yes, so we do have access to the dashboard and we can share it. We're working on a new version this year that will have a better interface and also better data, even more data. But within the CG, we'll be sharing that. Yeah, and so to some extent, it will also be available on our public website. Okay, great. Any other
Gail,
questions?
we have a
Yes.
question online. Fred is asking any opportunities for partnering with industry at CG-wide level, for example, for laboratory management, where technology is fast changing.
Yeah, definitely. And this is kind of the description here on the screen. And this is what Breeding Resources is working on, in fact, is partnership with private sector to try to improve their lab services. But yeah, I wonder if we could do that with the labs that we have. I think an analysis would have to be done about the viability of having, for each lab, because there are different lab types. There are labs that we need to do research, to experiment, and to see if this is working or that are working, etc. Do our work there. But for lab services where we're just turning out results, we're just testing something and we're getting results, some of those may be better outsourced. And I think Andreas knows more about that.
Yeah, no, the eternal discussion about what common services labs we can have, what's outsourced, and what are labs that nobody else can have because we are doing a specific kind of research. It's always been there. We have examples of common services lab that have successfully supported the rest of the institution or actually worldwide. So there's examples of such things happening. But this requires activity-based costing discipline, meaning if you have the capacity in-house and the institution has invested heavily to make this available, investing heavily is not only having the staff and the equipment, is to have the certifications permanently. Because as a common services lab, you must be able to provide these services that are under some international standard, so that when they go compare you to UC Davis or any of these larger institutions that are heavily subsidized, by the way, you're able to say, well, in equal footing and I'm next to you rather than on the other side of the ocean. One advantage that CG centers have, that labs in the CG centers have, that most international labs do not have, is that they're not here. So many times when you want to have your analysis done, even if you want to outsource it somewhere in Europe, you cannot, because illegally you are not allowed to send this particular sample to the US or Europe or Japan or whatever place. So yeah, there's plenty of experience on dealing with this. But like I said, I'm really very, very happy that you have been able to lead this, to show and showcase the situation. So we do have some experience dealing with these issues. It's just that we would need to actually agree on the best way forward. But it is possible. And of course, from experience on these areas, frankly, if you're not using it, find somebody else who can use it, like, local universities or NARS or any of this sort of thing. And this is pretty straightforward, except for really specialized equipment. I have to say, really specialized equipment, once the project is over, nobody wants it. But if you're not using it, going back to that point, it's best to get rid of it, because once you realize what it costs to keep something just sitting there, feelings go away very quickly. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Yes?
Thanks.
No? Oh, yes. Did you say?
Thanks, Gail, for your insightful presentation. My name is Peter. I'm the head of security for C4 aircraft within the neighborhood. Mine is a comment. This discussion, in my thoughts, would have been very interesting if we brought in the people dimension. Because while we are looking at the physical aspects, I look over the security of the people and these critical assets. So it would have been interesting to hear from the people or HR colleagues also look at how we maintain, and at the end of the day, maintain critical staff who manage these particular facilities. Thanks.
That's a really good point. I think things can look simple on paper, but when you get human beings involved, it gets more complicated, and it's important to see the different perspectives. All right. I think then if there's not any more questions, we can wrap up a little early. Yeah, I will stick around. So if anyone wants to have a discussion, or if there's any great case studies that you want to tell me about, I would love to hear about it, because we would like to write them up for the study we're doing. So thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for those online as well.
Thank you, Gail. Brilliant presentation.